Welcome to Cheating Story Exposed. When you're done watching, share this story, someone might need to hear it. My name is Nathan Cross, and for 6 months I pretended to be someone I wasn't. I let a man belittle me, humiliate me, and eventually fire me, all while I documented every single move he made. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud, it's strategic. And when it finally comes, it's absolutely devastating. Let me take you back to where this all started. I was 28 years old when I sold my first tech startup for $8 million. It wasn't Facebook money, but it was enough to completely change my life. I'd spent 4 years building that company from my apartment, learning every aspect of business from product development to sales to operations. When the acquisition went through, I suddenly had more money than I knew what to do with, and a hunger to do something meaningful with it. That's when I met Gerald Hoffman and his investment group. Gerald was in his mid-50s, the kind of guy who wore expensive suits and talked about synergies and disruption in every sentence. His group was looking at investing in a mid-sized logistics software company called Streamline Solutions. The company had solid fundamentals, but had been struggling with leadership issues and declining employee retention. The numbers looked good on paper, but Gerald and his partners wanted someone to go in and assess the real situation from the inside. Not a standard consultant who'd be spotted a mile away, but someone who could actually work there, see how the leadership operated day to day, and report back on whether the company was worth the investment. We need someone who understands business operations, Gerald told me over drinks at an upscale steakhouse. Someone who can evaluate whether the leadership team is actually capable of scaling this company, or if we'd be inheriting a disaster. I'd made my initial investment commitment of $2 million. Enough to eventually give me a seat at the table, but not enough to attract attention during the due diligence period. The plan was simple. I'd go in as a mid-level operations analyst, work there for 6 months, and provide detailed reports on the company's real problems. If my assessment was positive, Gerald's group would finalize the full investment. If not, we'd walk away. What if they recognize you? Gerald asked. You've been in the news with the acquisition. I laughed. The acquisition got a few mentions in tech blogs, but nothing mainstream. I'll use my middle name, change my appearance a bit, and keep a low profile. Trust me, most people don't pay that much attention. So Nathan Cross became Nathan Walsh. I grew out my beard, started wearing glasses I didn't need, and bought an entirely new wardrobe of average business casual clothes. The Nathan who sold a startup wore designer jeans and limited edition sneakers. Nathan Walsh wore Docker khakis and button-down shirts from Target. My first day at Streamline Solutions, I met the man who would become the central focus of my investigation. Christopher Brennan, the Chief Operations Officer. Christopher was 42 tall, with perfect silver hair that he clearly spent time styling. He had the kind of presence that filled a room, but not in a good way, in a way that made everyone tense. He ran the operations department with an iron fist, and I was assigned directly to his team. Nathan Walsh, he said, barely glancing at my resume during our first meeting. Graduated from state, worked at a couple of no-name companies. Honestly, I don't know why HR hired you, but you're here now, so try not to screw anything up. I smiled politely. I'll do my best, Mr. Brennan. It's Christopher, and your best better be excellent because I don't tolerate mediocrity. He tossed a thick folder across his desk. This is the Meridian account. They're threatening to pull their contract because of delivery delays. Figure out what's going wrong and report back to me by end of week. The Meridian account turned out to be a mess, but not because of the reasons Christopher assumed. I spent the next 3 days digging through data, talking to warehouse staff, and reviewing shipment logs. The problem wasn't operational efficiency. The problem was that Christopher had redirected resources away from Meridian to prioritize a much smaller client who happened to be owned by his college roommate. I documented everything meticulously. Emails, resource allocation reports, timeline comparisons. Then I wrote up my analysis and presented it to Christopher, carefully framing it as a discovery rather than an accusation. The bottleneck appears to be in resource allocation, I said during our Friday meeting. If we shifted some capacity back to Meridian from the Peterson account, we could resolve their delays within 2 weeks. Christopher's face darkened. Are you suggesting I made a mistake in prioritizing Peterson? Not at all. I'm just presenting the data about where our capacity is currently allocated versus where our contractual obligations lie. He stood up, towering over me. Let me make something very clear, Walsh. You're an analyst. That means you analyze what I tell you to analyze. You don't question my strategic decisions. You don't second-guess my priorities. And you certainly don't come into my office implying that I'm playing favorites. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Good. Now get out. I left his office and immediately sent a detailed report to Gerald. Christopher Brennan was exactly the kind of leader who would sink this company. He was territorial, defensive, and making decisions based on personal relationships rather than business logic. But one incident wasn't enough. Gerald needed a complete picture. Over the next month, I watched Christopher operate, and the pattern became clear. He was a micromanager who took credit for his team's work and blamed them for his failures. He played favorites aggressively, promoting people who flattered him while sidelining anyone who showed independent thinking. And most concerning, he was cooking the books in subtle ways, shifting expenses between departments to make his operations numbers look better than they were. I documented all of it. Every instance of financial manipulation, every time he berated an employee, every decision that prioritized his ego over company performance. I recorded meetings where he screamed at team members for minor mistakes. I kept copies of emails where he took credit for work his analysts had done. I built a comprehensive file that painted a detailed picture of his leadership style. But Christopher wasn't just a bad manager. He was also smart enough to be dangerous. He'd covered his tracks well enough that casual observation wouldn't reveal the problems. You had to be looking specifically for the patterns, and you had to understand business operations well enough to spot them. Around month 3, things escalated. A major client, Harrison Industries, was considering expanding their contract significantly. The deal would bring in millions in additional revenue and establish Streamline as the leader in their market sector. Christopher was leading the pitch, and he assembled a team to prepare the presentation. I wasn't on that team initially, but one of the analysts, who was a sharp woman named Lisa Chen, got pneumonia and had to take medical leave. Christopher grudgingly pulled me in as her replacement. "Don't screw this up, Walsh," he told me. "This pitch needs to be perfect. Harrison is going to make us or break us." I spent 2 weeks working 18-hour days on that presentation. I rebuilt their entire cost analysis, created new visualization models for their data, and identified 3 additional service packages that Harrison hadn't even considered, but that would solve problems they'd mentioned in preliminary meetings. The night before the pitch, Christopher called a team meeting to review everything. I presented my sections, walking through the analysis and recommendations. The room was silent when I finished. "This is actually good," Christopher finally said. "Really good. Walsh, you might not be as useless as I thought." The next morning, I arrived at the office to find the presentation had been completely reorganized. All of my analysis was still there, but my name had been removed from every slide. In the credits at the end, Christopher had listed himself as the primary author, with the rest of the team in small print at the bottom. I said nothing. I just documented it and added it to my growing file. The Harrison pitch went perfectly. The clients were impressed, particularly with the additional service packages I developed. They signed an expanded contract on the spot, bringing in an additional $4 million in annual revenue. Christopher got praised by the CEO in an all-company meeting. He got a bonus. He got profiled in an internal company newsletter about innovative leadership. My name was never mentioned, but I got something more valuable than recognition. I got to watch him do exactly what I'd predicted he would do, in exactly the way that would be most damaging when it eventually came to light. By month 4, Christopher had apparently decided I was competent enough to be useful but not threatening enough to worry about. He started giving me more significant projects, more access to sensitive information. He didn't realize he was handing me exactly what I needed. I discovered that he'd been manipulating department budgets for at least 2 years, consistently moving expenses around to hit his performance targets while making other departments look less efficient. I found emails showing he'd blocked several talented employees from promotions because they disagreed with him in meetings. I uncovered a pattern of him steering contracts toward companies owned by friends and family. Members even when better options were available. And through it all, I watched how he treated people. He was the kind of manager who would publicly humiliate someone for a small mistake, then tell them it was tough love, and they should be grateful for his mentorship. He created an environment where people were terrified of making decisions without his approval, then criticized them for not showing initiative. The department's turnover rate was 40% annually. That's catastrophic in any industry, but Christopher managed to convince upper management it was because millennials don't want to work, rather than because his leadership was toxic. Everything came to a head in month 5. I'd been assigned to audit our vendor relationships, looking for potential cost savings. What I found was alarming. Christopher had been approving contracts with a logistics subcontractor called Brennan Transport Solutions. It took me exactly 1 Google search to discover that Brennan Transport Solutions was owned by Christopher's brother. This wasn't a small side arrangement. Over the past 3 years, Streamline had paid Brennan Transport Solutions over $6 million in fees. And those fees were approximately 30% higher than market rate for comparable services. Christopher was essentially funneling company money to his family business, and he'd been doing it for years. I spent a week verifying everything, pulling contracts, comparing rates, documenting the family connection. Then I prepared 2 versions of my report. One was the sanitized version I'd give to Christopher, noting that we could save costs by renegotiating vendor contracts without specifically naming which vendors. The other was the complete version, with all the details about the family business and financial irregularities, which went straight to Gerald. I gave Christopher the sanitized version on a Friday afternoon. He glanced through it and shrugged. Fine, pursue it if you want. But don't expect miracles. These vendor relationships are carefully cultivated. You can't just demand lower prices without risking the service quality. Understood, I said. I'll be careful about which vendors I approach. That night, I sent Gerald the complete report along with my recommendation. Streamline Solutions has excellent bones, but Christopher Brennan is a liability who's actively harming the company and possibly engaging in fraud. If we invest, he needs to be removed, and we need to be prepared for the legal complications that might follow. Gerald called me within an hour. Nathan, this is explosive. Are you absolutely certain about all of this? I have documentation for everything. Emails, contracts, financial records, meeting recordings. It's all time-stamped and verified. Then we're moving forward. The investment closes in 3 weeks. We'll keep your cover until then, but start preparing for the reveal. This is going to get ugly. I knew he was right, but I didn't know exactly how ugly until the following Monday. I walked into the office to find Christopher waiting at my desk, his face red with fury. 3 other managers were with him, including the head of HR. Conference room. Now, Christopher snapped. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my expression neutral. Of course. We filed into the conference room. Christopher closed the door hard enough that it rattled the glass walls. He threw a folder on the table in front of me. Want to explain this? I opened the folder. It was my vendor analysis, but not the sanitized version. Someone had printed out a draft version from my computer that included preliminary notes about the Brennan Transport Solutions connection. Been careless. I'd saved a draft to my work laptop while preparing the report, intending to delete it before I sent Christopher the clean version. I'd been so focused on getting everything to Gerald that I'd forgotten to wipe the draft from my local drive. And Christopher apparently had it monitoring my computer. I can explain, I started. Oh, I think it's very clear, Christopher interrupted. You've been conducting some kind of investigation into my business decisions, making accusations about vendor relationships, implying corruption. He leaned forward. Who are you working for, Walsh? Which competitor paid you to infiltrate this company? No one paid me. I was just doing the analysis you assigned me. Bullshit. This goes way beyond cost analysis. You've been digging into family connections, looking at multi-year contract histories. This is corporate espionage. The HR manager, a nervous-looking woman named Patricia, spoke up. Mr. Walsh, these are very serious allegations. If you've been sharing confidential company information with outside parties, I haven't shared anything with competitors, I said truthfully. Gerald and his investment group weren't competitors. Then who? Christopher demanded. I said nothing. I couldn't blow my cover, not yet. We were 3 weeks from the investment closing. Christopher's smile was cruel. Your silence tells me everything I need to know. Patricia, I want him fired, immediately, for cause, corporate espionage, breach of confidentiality, and conducting unauthorized investigations into company executives. Christopher, we should really investigate this more thoroughly before. Fire him. Now. Or I'll have questions about HR's role in allowing a corporate spy to operate for months. Patricia looked miserable, but she nodded. Mr. Walsh, effective immediately, your employment is terminated for cause. Please collect your personal belongings under security supervision and leave the premises within the hour. Christopher wasn't done. And Walsh, I'll be recommending criminal charges. You just destroyed your career over whatever money someone paid you. I hope it was worth it. 2 security guards escorted me back to my desk. The entire operations department watched in silence. As I packed my few personal items into a box, Christopher stood nearby, arms crossed, making sure everyone saw this, making an example of me. Let this be a lesson, he announced to the department. This is what happens when someone lacks integrity, when they lack leadership material. Walsh thought he could play games with confidential information, and now he's finished. In this company, we have standards. I carried my box through the office, past dozens of staring employees. Some looked sympathetic. Most looked relieved it wasn't them. Christopher had cultivated a culture of fear so effective that no one would even make eye contact with me as I left. The security guards walked me to my car and watched me drive away. I called Gerald before I'd even left the parking lot. They found a draft report on my laptop, I explained. Christopher had IT monitoring my computer. He thinks I'm a corporate spy. He fired me for cause and is threatening criminal charges. Gerald was quiet for a moment. How much did he see? The vendor analysis with the family business connection, but not the full report, not all the financial irregularities or the documentation of his other issues. Then we're still in good shape. Better, actually, he just fired someone who's about to be revealed as an investor representative. That's going to look catastrophic for him. Can you hold out for 3 more weeks? I don't have much choice. Stay low. Don't respond to anything from Streamline. Let him think he won. The board meeting is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. The full investor group will be there, including you. That's when we drop everything. Those 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Christopher had spread word through the industry that I was a corporate spy who'd been fired for cause. I got calls from former colleagues, confused messages asking what had happened. I couldn't defend myself without blowing the entire operation, so I just stayed silent and let him destroy my reputation. He was thorough about it, too. He gave an interview to an industry blog about the importance of information security, where he described firing an employee who'd been conducting unauthorized investigations into executive activities. He never named me directly, but anyone in the industry could figure out who he meant. I watched my professional reputation get shredded in real time, and I couldn't say a word. But Gerald kept me updated on the back end. The investment was proceeding on schedule. The investor group now had full access to Streamline's books and operations. They'd confirmed everything in my reports and uncovered even more issues I hadn't had time to investigate. Christopher's manipulation of departmental budgets, his family business arrangements, his pattern of retaliation against employees, all of it was documented and verified. "He's done," Gerald told me 4 days before the board meeting. "Even if he didn't know you were working for us, his behavior has been so egregious that the board would probably remove him anyway. But the fact that he fired you specifically for investigating his misconduct, that's going to be the nail in the coffin." The board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday. The investor group would be presenting their findings and formally finalizing the investment that would give them controlling interest in the company. All executive leadership would be present, including Christopher. I dressed carefully that morning. Not Nathan Walsh in his Target khakis. Nathan Cross in a custom Tom Ford suit I hadn't worn in 6 months. No glasses, trimmed beard, the version of myself who'd sold a company for $8 million. I arrived at Streamline's headquarters at 9:45 a.m. The receptionist didn't recognize me. "Nathan Cross," I said. "I'm with the Hoffman Investment Group." Her eyes widened slightly as she checked the list. "Yes, Mr. Cross, the boardroom is on the 8th floor. You're expected." I rode the elevator up, watching the floors tick by. 6 months of work, 6 months of documentation, 6 months of letting Christopher Brennan think he'd won, all of it coming together in the next hour. The boardroom was exactly what you'd expect. Massive table, leather chairs, windows overlooking the city. Gerald was already there, along with his partners and Streamline's CEO, a man named Thomas Whitmore. The other executives were filing in, including Christopher. Christopher was holding court near the coffee setup, telling some story that had a couple of the junior executives laughing nervously. He looked confident, relaxed. Why wouldn't he be? He'd just secured the Harrison contract. He'd removed a threatening employee. From his perspective, everything was going his way. Then he saw me. I watched the exact moment recognition hit. His face went from confidence to confusion to something approaching horror. He looked at me, then at Gerald, then back at me. "What is he doing here?" Christopher's voice was tight. Thomas Whitmore looked confused. "Christopher, this is Nathan Cross. He's one of the principal investors with the Hoffman Group." "That's not Nathan Cross, that's Nathan Walsh. He worked for me. I fired him 3 weeks ago for corporate espionage." Gerald smiled. "Actually, Christopher, Nathan Walsh and Nathan Cross are the same person. Nathan has been working undercover in your department for the past 6 months as part of our due diligence process. Everything he discovered during that time has been documented and verified." The room went completely silent. Christopher's face cycled through several shades of red. "That's illegal. You can't do that. You planted a spy in my department." "We placed an investor representative in an operational role to assess the company's real situation," Gerald corrected. "Which is entirely legal and part of standard due diligence for investments of this size. What is not legal, however, is approximately 3 years of financial misconduct, vendor fraud, and employee retaliation that Nathan documented during his time here." Thomas Whitmore set down his coffee. "Gerald, what exactly are you talking about?" I think Nathan should present his findings directly, Gerald said, gesturing to me. After all, he saw it all firsthand. I opened my laptop and connected to the room's presentation system. 6 months of documentation loaded onto the screen behind me. My name is Nathan Cross, I began, looking directly at Christopher. 6 months ago, I invested $2 million in this company and took a position in operations to assess whether Streamline was a sound investment. What I found was a company with excellent fundamentals being actively damaged by executive misconduct. I clicked to the first slide. Let's start with vendor fraud. Christopher Brennan has been approving contracts with Brennan Transport Solutions, a company owned by his brother, for the past 3 years. Streamline has paid this company over $6 million in fees that are approximately 30% above market rate. Christopher has failed to disclose this family relationship and has actively blocked attempts to renegotiate these contracts. Christopher stood up. This is ridiculous. Thomas, you can't seriously be listening to this. He's a disgruntled employee I fired for. Sit down, Christopher, Thomas said quietly. His face had gone pale. I continued through the slides. The budget manipulation. The stolen credit for team members' work, particularly the Harrison presentation. The pattern of retaliation against employees who questioned his decisions. The toxic culture that had created 40% annual turnover. With each revelation, I played recordings, showed emails, displayed financial records. Everything time-stamped, everything verified, everything undeniable. Christopher tried to interrupt several times, but Gerald cut him off. You'll have a chance to respond when Nathan finishes. The presentation took 40 minutes. By the end, Thomas Whitmore looked like he might be sick. The other executives were staring at Christopher with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. The HR manager, Patricia, was taking notes with shaking hands. In conclusion, I said, Streamline Solutions is a fundamentally strong company being held back by leadership that prioritizes personal benefit over company performance. With proper management, this company could easily double its revenue within 3 years. With the current operations leadership, it will continue to bleed talent and lose market share. I closed my laptop and looked at Christopher. For what it's worth, you were right about one thing. I'm not leadership material. Not the kind you represent anyway. I'd never steal credit from my team. I'd never funnel company money to my family. And I'd never create a workplace so toxic that good people are desperate to leave. Christopher had gone from red to white. He stood up, gripping the table. This is character assassination. You have no right. I have every right, I interrupted. I'm an investor in this company. I have a fiduciary duty to identify risks and recommend changes. And you, Christopher, are the single biggest risk this company faces. Thomas Whitmore cleared his throat. Christopher, I think you should leave the room while the board discusses this. Thomas, you've known me for 15 years. You're going to believe some kid who lied about his identity over. The identity doesn't matter, Thomas said. What matters is whether these allegations are true, and from what I've just seen, they appear to be extensively documented and verified. So yes, I need you to leave while we discuss this. Christopher looked around the room, searching for allies. He found none. Even the executives who'd been laughing at his jokes earlier were avoiding eye contact. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed toward the door, stopping to point at me. You haven't won anything. I'll sue you personally. I'll sue the company. I'll make sure everyone in this industry knows what kind of person you really are. Feel free, I said calmly. I have 6 months of documentation showing exactly what kind of person I am. Someone who does thorough research before making investment decisions. What kind of documentation do you have? He left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the walls. The board discussion took another 2 hours. They reviewed every piece of evidence I'd presented. They called in the company's attorneys. They discussed potential criminal charges and civil liability. By the end, the decision was unanimous. Christopher Brennan was terminated immediately for cause. All unvested stock options were forfeited. The company would be conducting a full forensic audit of his department's finances and would be referring the vendor fraud issue to law enforcement. He would receive no severance package and no positive references. Furthermore, Streamline would be implementing new oversight procedures for all vendor relationships, mandatory financial disclosures for any executive with family members in relevant businesses, and a complete review of the operations department's culture and processes. Thomas Whitmore looked exhausted when it was over. "Nathan, I owe you an apology. If you hadn't gone undercover, we might never have discovered any of this until it was too late." "The signs were there," I said. The turnover rate alone should have triggered questions, but Christopher was good at deflecting attention and explaining away problems. "What happens now?" Thomas asked Gerald. "Now we finalize the investment, bring in some operational consultants to help with the transition, and probably promote several people who have been held back by Christopher's management style. This company has a lot of potential. We just need to let the actual talent rise to the surface." As we were leaving, Patricia from HR pulled me aside. "Mr. Cross, I need to apologize. When Christopher told me to fire you, I should have pushed back harder. I should have insisted on a proper investigation." "He had you intimidated," I said. "That was his whole strategy, make everyone too afraid to question him. You weren't the only one." "Still, I should have been braver. For what it's worth, there are a lot of people in that operations department who are going to be relieved when they hear about this." He made everyone miserable. The news spread through Streamline within hours. By that evening, I was getting messages from former colleagues, the people who'd watched me get fired 3 weeks earlier, asking if the rumors were true. I confirmed it with a simple statement. "Christopher Brennan has been removed as COO following an investigation into financial misconduct and employee retaliation. The investigation was conducted during my 6-month undercover assignment as part of investor due diligence. All allegations have been documented and verified. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of current and former Streamline employees reached out, sharing their own stories about Christopher's behavior. Several people told me they'd been documenting incidents for months, but had been too afraid to report them. Some had left the company specifically because of him. Lisa Chen, the analyst who'd gotten pneumonia during the Harrison pitch, sent me a particularly meaningful message. "You were the only person who gave me credit for my work on that project. Christopher told everyone I'd barely contributed before getting sick. Thank you for caring about the truth." The industry reaction was more mixed. Some people praised the investigation as thorough due diligence. Others criticized the undercover approach as deceptive. I got invited to speak on a podcast about corporate oversight, where the host grilled me about the ethics of working undercover. "I understand the concern," I told him. "But consider the alternative. If I'd come in as an openly identified investor, Christopher would have been on his best behavior. I never would have seen the real culture he'd created. The vendor fraud would have stayed hidden. The budget manipulation would have continued. Sometimes you need to see how people behave when they think no one important is watching." Christopher, meanwhile, was busy trying to control his narrative. He gave an interview to a business publication, claiming he'd been the victim of a coordinated attack by investors who wanted to take control of the company. He implied that my evidence had been fabricated or taken out of context. That lasted exactly 2 days before the forensic audit results came back. The accounting firm confirmed everything I'd documented and found additional irregularities I'd missed. The total amount Christopher had diverted to his family business was actually closer to $8 million, not 6. And there were indications he'd been manipulating bonus calculations to ensure his department's performance always looked better than it actually was. The district attorney opened a criminal investigation. Christopher hired a very expensive lawyer. The industry publications that had been sympathetic to him went quiet. 3 months after the board meeting, Streamline Solutions promoted a woman named Jennifer Martinez to COO. Jennifer had been one of Christopher's senior analysts, someone he'd consistently overlooked for advancement despite her obvious competence. Under her leadership, the operations department's turnover rate dropped from 40% to 12% within 6 months. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvement. And the company landed 2 major new contracts that had been in development but stalled under Christopher's chaotic management style. The Harrison Industries relationship, which Christopher had taken credit for, continued to grow. When I met with their VP of operations at a conference, he pulled me aside. "I heard what happened at Streamline," he said. "Between you and me, we were about to pull the contract. Christopher was impossible to work with. He'd promise things he couldn't deliver, then blame his team when projects failed. The only reason we stayed was because of the quality of the work his analysts were doing. People like you and that presentation you built. We knew there was talent there, even if the leadership was problematic." "Well, you've got better leadership now," I told him. "Jennifer Martinez is the real deal. We've noticed. We're actually looking at expanding the contract again." As for me, I remained involved with Streamline as an active board member, but I didn't return to undercover work. 1 6-month stint was enough for a lifetime. I invested in several other companies through Gerald's group, but always openly, always with my real identity. People sometimes ask me if I regret the deception, if I feel bad about letting Christopher fire me knowing what would happen later. The truth? Not even a little bit. Christopher Brennan created a toxic environment that damaged people's careers and mental health. He stole credit from talented employees. He funneled millions in company money to his family. He built a culture where people were afraid to speak up about problems. And he did all of it with arrogance and confidence, secure in the belief that his position protected him from consequences. Watching him realize that his position meant nothing, that his intimidation tactics didn't work on someone who actually had power, that all his manipulation had been documented and verified, that was worth every moment of humiliation I endured during those 6 months. The last I heard, Christopher was working as a consultant for a small firm, making a fraction of his former salary. His reputation in the industry was destroyed. The criminal case was still pending, with potential charges including fraud and embezzlement. His brother's logistics company had lost most of its clients once word got out about the corrupt relationship. Meanwhile, Streamline Solutions grew 28% in the first year after Christopher's removal. Employee retention improved dramatically. The company won industry awards for workplace culture, and the investment that Gerald and I had been part of returned significant value. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or immediate. Sometimes it's quiet, strategic, and absolutely devastating. It's about building an airtight case, letting someone expose themselves completely, and then revealing the truth at exactly the right moment for maximum impact. I learned something important during those 6 months as Nathan Walsh. When you're underestimated, when people think you're powerless, they show you exactly who they really are. Christopher never would have acted the way he did if he'd known I was an investor. He would have been careful, political, strategic. But because he saw me as just another mid-level analyst with no power and no connections, he let me see the real him. And that real version was exactly what the board needed to see to make the right decision. A year after the board meeting, Streamline held its annual company gathering. Gerald suggested I attend, and I figured why not. I wanted to see how the company had transformed. The difference was remarkable. People were smiling, laughing, collaborating openly. The operations department that had been tense and fearful under Christopher now buzzed with creative energy. Jennifer Martinez gave a presentation about the department's achievements, and she did something Christopher never did. She specifically named and thanked the team members who'd contributed to each success. During the networking portion, several people approached me. Some thanked me for what I'd done. Others admitted they'd been skeptical at first about the undercover approach, but now saw why it had been necessary. One younger analyst, a guy named Marcus who'd started just before Christopher was fired, pulled me aside. "I almost didn't take this job," he told me. "I'd heard rumors about the operations department being a difficult place to work, but by the time I started, Christopher was gone and Jennifer had just been promoted. I got lucky with timing." "You got lucky that good leadership recognized talent," I corrected. "Jennifer would have promoted and developed people like you even under the old system. Christopher just wouldn't have let her." "Still," Marcus said, "thank you for doing what you did. This is my first job out of college, and I can't imagine working somewhere like how people described it under Brennan. The stories I've heard are insane." Those stories had become part of Streamline's culture in an odd way, not celebrated but acknowledged. The company used Christopher's tenure as a case study in leadership training about what not to do, how toxic leadership destroys value, and why corporate culture matters as much as financial performance. Thomas Whitmore found me near the end of the event. "Nathan, got a minute?" We stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "I wanted to thank you again," Thomas said. "Not just for the investigation, but for how you handled the whole thing. You could have been vindictive. You could have leaked information to the press or tried to destroy Christopher beyond what was necessary. But you kept it professional, focused on the evidence, and let the facts speak for themselves." "Christopher destroyed himself," I said. "I just documented it." "That's what I mean. You had every reason to be angry after he fired you and tried to destroy your reputation. But you stayed strategic. That takes discipline. It takes knowing that the truth is more powerful than revenge," I said. "If I'd gone public early, Christopher could have claimed I was a disgruntled employee, making false accusations. By waiting, by letting the investment close and presenting everything through proper channels, there was no room for him to spin the narrative." Thomas nodded slowly. "You know, we've had 3 different companies reach out asking about our due diligence process. Word has spread about what you did. Some people think it's brilliant. Some think it's unethical. Everyone thinks it's fascinating. What do you think?" He considered for a moment. "I think you saved this company. Christopher was slowly destroying everything we'd built, and he'd gotten good enough at hiding it that we didn't see the full extent until you showed us. So whatever ethical questions people want to debate, I'm grateful you were willing to do it." We stood in comfortable silence, watching the city lights start to emerge as darkness fell. "What's next for you?" Thomas asked. "More investments, but nothing undercover. I've learned I'm better at evaluating opportunities than pretending to be someone I'm not for months at a time." "You were pretty convincing as Nathan Walsh," Thomas laughed. "Several people told me after the reveal that they never suspected a thing. That's because I wasn't pretending about the work. I genuinely analyzed every project, genuinely tried to solve problems, genuinely collaborated with the team. The only thing I was hiding was why I was doing it." Thomas extended his hand. "Well, thank you for everything. Streamline is a better company because of what you did." I shook his hand. "Streamline is a better company because you were willing to act on what I found. A lot of CEOs would have protected Christopher, tried to sweep it under the rug, prioritized short-term stability over long-term health. You didn't do that." After the event, I drove home thinking about the whole experience. 6 months of my life spent proving that sometimes the best way to evaluate something is from the inside, at ground level, where the truth can't be hidden. Behind executive presentations and carefully managed appearances, Christopher had called me not leadership material in his final statement before I was fired. He meant it as an insult, implying I didn't have the toughness or vision to lead. But he was wrong about what leadership material looks like. Real leadership isn't about intimidation or taking credit or protecting your position at all costs. It's about creating environments where talented people can thrive. It's about making decisions based on what's best for the organization, not what's best for your ego. It's about being secure enough in your own abilities that you don't need to tear others down to feel powerful. Christopher represented everything leadership shouldn't be. And in the end, that's exactly what destroyed him, not my investigation, not the evidence I gathered. His own actions, his own choices, his own inability to lead with integrity. I was just the person who made sure those actions had consequences. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't taken that undercover assignment. Would Christopher have continued manipulating budgets and funneling money to his family? Would talented employees like Jennifer Martinez have eventually left out of frustration? Would Streamline have slowly declined under his toxic leadership until it was too late to save? Probably. Bad leadership doesn't usually fix itself. It gets worse, more entrenched, more confident in its invincibility. Christopher had been operating that way for years, and no one had successfully challenged him because he'd made himself too intimidating to question. That's the real danger of people like Christopher. Not just what they do, but how they silence anyone who might hold them accountable. They create systems where speaking up is more dangerous than staying quiet, where documenting problems is seen as disloyalty, where questioning decisions is treated as insubordination. The only way to break that system is from a position they can't intimidate. That's what my undercover role gave me, the ability to see and document everything without Christopher being able to threaten or manipulate me into silence. Could I have done it differently? Maybe, but I'm not sure any other approach would have been as effective. Standard due diligence would have given us financial records and employee surveys, but it wouldn't have captured the day-to-day reality of Christopher's leadership. It wouldn't have shown us how he stole credit, how he retaliated against employees, how he created a culture of fear. You have to see someone when they think they're untouchable to understand who they really are. And Christopher, when he thought he was untouchable, was exactly as bad as the evidence showed. 6 months after the company gathering, I received an unexpected email. It was from one of the operations analysts who'd been on the Harrison pitch team, a guy named David Portman who'd left Streamline shortly before I'd started. "Nathan," he wrote, "I just heard about what happened with Christopher Brennan. I wanted to reach out because I was one of the people he destroyed. He took credit for a major project I'd led, then fired me when I tried to bring it up with HR. He made sure I couldn't get good references, told other companies I was difficult to work with, and basically blackballed me from the industry. It took me a year to rebuild my career. When I heard what you did, how you documented everything and made sure he faced consequences, I actually cried. Thank you for doing what I couldn't. Thank you for making sure he couldn't do to anyone else what he did to me." I read that email 3 times. David's story was exactly what I'd suspected. Christopher had been doing this for years. Destroying careers, stealing credit, protecting his position through fear and retaliation. And because he'd done it systematically, because he'd been smart about covering his tracks, no individual victim had been able to stop him. It took someone with resources, with investor protection, with the ability to operate outside Christopher's control, to finally document everything comprehensively enough to take him down. I wrote back to David, thanking him for sharing his story and asking if he'd be willing to talk to Streamline's attorneys. His testimony about the pattern of behavior going back years before my investigation could be valuable in the criminal case. He agreed immediately. Anything that helps make sure he can't do this again. That's what it was really about. Not revenge, not even justice in the abstract sense. It was about making sure Christopher Brennan couldn't keep hurting people, couldn't keep creating toxic environments, couldn't keep abusing his position to benefit himself at everyone else's expense. The criminal case is still ongoing as I write this. The district attorney has charged Christopher with fraud, embezzlement, and several other counts related to the vendor scheme. His lawyers are fighting aggressively, but the evidence is overwhelming. My 6 months of documentation, combined with the forensic audit and testimony from employees like David, has built a case that's very hard to defend against. Streamline has recovered, and then some. Last quarter, they announced record revenue and industry-leading employee satisfaction scores. Jennifer Martinez was featured in a business magazine article about innovative operational leadership. 3 former Christopher employees who'd left the company have returned, saying they wanted to be part of the transformed culture. And me? I'm still investing, still evaluating companies, still trying to identify opportunities where good fundamentals are being held back by bad leadership or operational problems. But I do it openly now as Nathan Cross with my real identity and my real credentials. The undercover experiment worked, but it's not something I want to repeat. 6 months of being underestimated, of watching someone steal credit and abuse power, of building a case while pretending everything was normal. That takes a toll. I'm glad I did it. I'm proud of the results. But once was enough. These days, when someone asks me about that time I got fired for not being leadership material, I smile and tell them the whole story. About how sometimes being underestimated is exactly where you want to be. About how patience and documentation are more powerful than confrontation. About how the truth, when properly revealed at exactly the right moment, can be absolutely devastating. Christopher Brennan thought he knew what leadership material looked like. Confidence, authority, decisiveness, the willingness to crush anyone who challenged him. He was wrong. Leadership material is Jennifer Martinez, who gives credit where it's due and creates environments where people want to contribute their best work. Leadership material is Thomas Whitmore, who was willing to remove a long-time executive when presented with evidence of misconduct, even though it was painful and complicated. Leadership material is every employee who kept trying to do good work despite Christopher's toxic management, who didn't let his behavior destroy their own integrity. And maybe, in a small way, leadership material is being willing to spend 6 months being underestimated and undervalued, because you know that documenting the truth will eventually create accountability. Christopher was right about one thing, though. I'm not his kind of leadership material, thank God for that. If you're in a workplace with a toxic leader, document everything. Keep records, save emails, note dates and times. You might feel powerless in the moment, but information is power, and eventually the truth has a way of coming to light. And if you're a leader yourself, remember, your position doesn't make you untouchable. It makes you accountable. The people you lead are watching everything you do. They know when you're taking credit that isn't yours. They know when you're retaliating against people who question you. They know when you're putting your own interests above the organization's. You might think you're getting away with it. Christopher Brennan thought he was getting away with it for years. But eventually, someone will be watching who has the power to hold you accountable. And when that day comes, all those small betrayals, all those manipulated budgets, all those stolen credits and retaliated employees, they'll be the evidence that destroys you. Lead with integrity, or eventually, someone will make sure you don't lead at all.